Welcome back. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the place of vital records in family history research, and hopefully make the case for why vital records are so important to be used if they can be found. We'll cover what vital records are, why we use them. We'll talk about the difference between primary and secondary records, talk about some challenges that vital records have. We'll do a little in-depth on what's actually on these records. We'll talk about what to do if they don't exist. In other words, we'll talk about finding substitutions. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about guided research, which is a tool that FamilySearch has developed that helps us with finding vital records, even for beginners to find vital records easily. Okay, so what are vital records? I went to our great font of all knowledge, Wikipedia, and they had an article on vital records, and they essentially said vital records are records of life events kept under government authority. In other words, these are government records for birth, marriage, separation, divorce, and death, all of these major events of our lives. And even in some places, you'll find records of civil unions and domestic partnerships that fall under vital records. Okay, every vital record has some primary information. Let's take a birth record. If it's a birth certificate, then the primary information is going to be what happened that made this record occur. In other words, what happened here that happened at the time the record was created. And of course, that's the birth of a child. So that's primary information because it's recorded right away. On it could be some secondary information. If you have like a death certificate, that birth information that's found on the death certificate becomes secondary information because it occurred a long time before the death certificate was created. And it's not going to be as accurate or reliable as the primary information that's found on the record. So we need to remember that we're looking for primary information especially, but sometimes we're able to pick up some secondary information from these records. Most of these records will have three kinds of things. They're going to have dates of an event. They're going to have the place of the event, and they're going to have some names on it, people that were involved in the record, or other family members that are associated with this event. Okay, why are vital records so important? Well, the main reason is that hopefully they're going to give you some accurate information. The names and dates and places found on them will be accurate, hopefully, and be able to provide you with those clues that you need in your research, better than the secondary records that you often go to in place of them, like a census. And so as an example, here's a census record from 1920. It shows my mother, Elizabeth, as a 2-year-old in the home of her parents, Claude and Carrie. And she's just 2 years old. So the assumption is these are her parents, and this is my mother. My grandfather will die, Claude will die before the 1930 census. And on that census, the family just consisted of Carrie and her daughter, Elizabeth. The question becomes, though, are Claude and Carrie really Elizabeth's parents? Well, vital records can come to the rescue. Unfortunately, I don't have my mother's birth certificate. I was really surprised when when I went to write this presentation that I somehow lost my mother's birth certificate. It's around there somewhere. So I had to go to another certificate, which is now secondary information, her death certificate, where it lists her mother correctly as Helen Alcesta Sands, and her father, Claude Irving Hale. Now, how do I know that's accurate? Well, I actually have other documentation in my possession, things that aren't vital records. Just as an FYI, I happen to have a letter from my grandfather to his future second wife, Carrie Lutz, where he tells Carrie of the sudden death of his wife, Helen. My grandmother died from childbirth of when my mother was born. And it was interesting that Helen and Carrie were very best friends. They were both nurses. And after his first wife, Helen, dies, Claude turns around and marries her best friend, Carrie, so that he has somebody to raise my mother. The bottom line is the vital records help to sort things like this out so that you know the accuracy of what you're looking at when you're looking at these other records. And hopefully, as you put your family together, you're able to put them together accurately. Now, there are a lot of limitations to vital records. They became used first in different parts of the United States, and that we're mainly talking about at different times. In New England, vital records go all the way back to the 17th century, to the 1600s. In the Northwest Territories, they began keeping some vital records as early as the early 1800s. Frequently, marriage records were the very first vital records that were kept in most localities. Birth and death information wasn't as important as keeping track of who married whom. In the early 1900s, before many certificates were created, a lot of counties kept records. Most vital records today in the United States are state records. But prior to that, counties were keeping records in what we call record books. You see an example of one at the bottom here on death records, or birth records, actually, from Ohio. In the early 1900s, as states began to standardize the process, they went to certificates. The problem was that by, say, 1915, most states had mandated birth records and things like that, but usually it took about 15 years after they were first mandated before you had pretty much universal coverage. A lot of people just never made the effort to get those licenses created for a birth or a marriage or a death. And so you're going to find records missing for people, especially at the beginning of the record keeping era. Okay, so what do these records actually include? So birth certificates often cover the name, the place, and date of birth for the person. This happens to be my older brother, who died shortly after he was born. That's why it's stamped deceased. It shows parent information. Oftentimes you'll see their names. You might find their age, their residence, if they were married or not, things of that nature, occupation in this case. You'll often find something that is very interesting, which is the child's birth order, which can kind of help you in knowing how many children are in the home or were born, let's say, to the mother. And oftentimes you'll find the mother's residence, not the father's, but the mother's residence, because they can guarantee you that's the mother because she gave birth. The man listed as the father is not always really the father. And so that's one thing you need to be aware of, is that fathers listed on birth certificates aren't always necessarily the father. And also, children who were adopted, you may not be able to find their record because it's usually sealed. You may find a later one that was done after the child was adopted. Marriage records are tricky in that there's not just one marriage record, there's a whole series of them. There are licenses, certificates, registers, returns, bonds. These are all different things that are part of the marriage process and the recording process of marriages. And they will have possibly different dates on them and different places even. And so you've got to be very careful what you're working with, because a lot of times people will take any of these and just call them the marriage record. You see a marriage record here from my grandparents. The top half of it is an actual license. That's the thing you go to the courthouse to get. and they applied for that license on the 20th of September, 1907. The bottom half of it is the actual marriage certificate that was filled out by the justice of the peace after they were married. And the marriage actually took place on the 25th of September, 5 days later. Now, if I find a record where it says they were married on the 20th, I know the person's looking at a marriage license. If it says the 25th, I know it's a marriage certificate they were looking at. So you've got to be careful and know what it is that was being recorded for the marriage. And the things that can be found on these records will vary from state to state, locality to locality. Generally, you'll find the names of the bride and groom, obviously, the date and place of the marriage, or whatever it is that that particular document is actually documenting. You may find the residence for the bride and groom. You may find information on their birth, dates and places, their ages, their occupations. Sometimes you'll find their parents' names and where their parents reside. And there'll usually be witnesses listed, which are often other relatives, though they don't have to be. And so there's a lot of different things that may or may not be on the record, depending on which of the records you're looking at and what locality this record comes from. And like I said, not all these marriage records are going to have all that information. You need to look at it carefully, though, to ascertain exactly what was being done through this document and what information is found on it that you can use. And realize, too, that if you're looking at licenses, just because there was a license issued does not mean that the couple married. Sometimes they fill out a license and then things change and they just don't get married. So beware of that. Okay, and bonds and attached permission notes are often accompanying underage people who get married. So watch for that. I have that in several cases in my family where I picked up extra information because of the bonds that had to be posted for an underage person, or the permission note that had to be given that verifies then where the people are located at a certain time. Okay, death records. Always remember the only primary information on the death record is, of course, the death date and the name of the person that died and where. Everything else on that record is going to be secondary information. They're usually going to find the name, possibly the birth date and place, the death date and place usually for sure, the age at death maybe, the occupation of the person possibly, their marriage status, names of their parents maybe, and surviving spouse. Notice surviving spouse. Usually if the spouse died first, they're just going to be listed as widowed, as you see in this document. You're not going to see the name of the spouse. And then the cause of death is usually recorded on here. The date and place of burial can be found usually down at the bottom and is often skipped over. Very important information. And there'll be an informant. And this person may or may not be related. And usually that helps indicate how accurate it is. If the person's not related and it's just a worker in the hospital, you may not have much very good information here at all. And other times, if it's a family member, you would think it would be good. But death records can be full of a lot of issues. And so I want to show you one. This is my great-grandmother. My mother was named Jenny Elizabeth for this lady, which I think is very ironic because my mother hated the name Jenny and always went by Elizabeth. That's important. You see, because Jenny Elizabeth was not Jenny's name. Jenny was really Elizabeth Jane, and she didn't like Elizabeth. And so in 1870, when she was getting married, she switched her name around and became Jenny Elizabeth because she wanted to be called Jenny. because she liked Jenny. So I've always thought that was kind of funny. My mother was named for the woman who didn't have that name. Okay, you're going to find birth date on this one is actually correct based on the family Bible, which we found just a few years ago. The death date, which is usually accurate, is in fact accurate. Her birthplace is listed as just Ohio. At least they got the state right. Unfortunately, they didn't give us any location. And then lastly, the parents are false. Just like the name was false, the parents are false. Their father was really John Beck. The informant had met Daniel when Daniel was an old man and must have thought that he was Jenny's father, when in fact he was actually Jenny's brother. And the mother, they didn't even know her name because she died many years before Jenny married. And her name was actually Mary Catherine Nail. And so who was this informant that gave the information? Well, it's May Sands Fulmer, the oldest child of this couple. Jenny and her husband, Henry Harrison Sands, married in Ohio in 1870. She was born shortly after, but then the family moved to Pennsylvania, where Henry had come from. And so she never had much contact with the Becks. And so she really didn't know much about her mother's prior life before marriage. And so fortunately, at least we had the date right in the right state, but everything else was wrong. So that's why I say you got to be real careful about death certificates. Okay, again, remember about these single line registers. A lot of people skip over these and don't even know they exist. Look for them, see if there are registrations on a county level for these records prior to the certificates and locations. This is my dad's birth record found in Arizona Territory in Gila County, where he was born, in their territorial vital statistics for 1903 to 1909. He was born on the 30th of October, 1908. And in those days, births were recorded by doctors as they went from home to home, assisting women giving birth, because most children were born in people's homes. And so as he went to the Givens home, he delivered a male boy. He didn't hang around long enough to find out what his name was, so he just wrote down Givens for the baby's name. He did fortunately get my grandparents' names, so I know it's my father because Josie and Krista Givens were the parents. And so this is the record of my father's birth. And this is all there is. But these registers can be of a great help. And again, they're not always universally used. You're just lucky often when you actually have a record of your relative's name. Notice how few of these children actually were recorded with a first name. Only about 3 or 4 on this whole page have a first name given. You just have to go by who the parents are and the time that the person was born, the date of birth. Okay, civil registrations. Now, in other countries, they don't call it vital records, they call it civil registrations. Essentially, we're talking the same thing. And many other countries will find these civil registrations actually go back further than our United States vital records do. They'll go back to usually around the mid to late 1800s, depending on which country. We're looking at one here that's a transcription for civil registrations in Scotland. And it says that they began in 1855. And so you can get back that far with civil registrations. You wouldn't get that far back in most places in the US. So these can be very good records. They're civil because they're kept by the government. And that's why it's called a civil record or public record. And they basically provide the same basic information that our vital records cover. And their purpose was the same, to help record the people. You see, in this case, one of my wife's ancestors It gives the child's name, sex, their parents, and the fact that it was a birth, the date of birth, and the location. And so this is a civil registration birth record. So as we conduct our research, the main thing we want to do is we want to try to support our information with the best possible record available and the ones that will help tie the families together and provide accuracy. And you're going to find that with vital records, if at all possible. Okay, then of course the fact becomes, what do you do if there aren't vital records? Well, actually, even sometimes even if there are vital records, you can't find them. If you're going to find that as you research back in time, you're going to get to a point where there are no more vital records. And as you're reaching that point, you may actually find you're in a place where the vital records got destroyed or were lost. Fires and floods and things like that happen. You also may find out that apparently the record just never was created for your ancestor. Those things happen. And lastly, the other issue you might find is the fact that it was transcribed wrong. Maybe it was filled out so illegibly that you can't read it, or the people transcribing couldn't read it, and thus it becomes very hard to find, even though it's there. So you have a lot of different issues that you have to deal with, especially as you work your way back in time. And so eventually you will reach that point, though, where you've gone beyond the vital records. And what you're going to have to do is find a way to substitute records. Vital record substitutions are just records that aren't vital records that will cover that information that you're looking for. And with a single best group, if you can find them and if it applies to your family, are church records. And the thing that's nice about church records is they will go back all the way possibly to the 1500s in some religions, and they will focus on what usually are called the sacraments: birth, baptism, marriage, and death and burial. And so you're going to get some of the same basic information through church records that you get from vital records or from the civil registrations in different countries. They kind of overlap and cover the same things, but these will go back even further. The problem is not all denominations kept detailed records. And like vital records, they can be lost or destroyed, especially since they're going back to, say, about the year 1500. And not all vital events were necessarily recorded. I have some families that weren't religious, and so since they weren't religious, you're not going to find many vital records for them. Okay, so everything considered, church records are often the go-to research tool in a lot of parts of the world when you've run out of the vital records, civil registration records, because they're just the best things there. Okay. In the US, birth substitutions can be things such as death records, the Social Security applications and death index, numident, as we call it, census records, cemetery records, church records, even military records, such as the World War I, World War II draft cards. Great source of information on people's births. Bible records. These are just some general things that will pertain in just about everywhere, some places better than others. For marriage substitutions, you can look for newspaper announcements, you can look for church records, obituaries, military records. There's a good example right below there for my second great grandfather, who actually was in the Indian Wars in Utah, and a wife applied for widow's pension from this. This is how we found out that he was actually in the Indian Wars and had a record of it with the government. So that's a military record that shows a marriage information. Doesn't give the date of marriage, but it lets you know that they were married. And you can look for death records because it'll often name the spouse, census records, Bible records. There's a lot of different records that you can find marriage information on them, though you won't always find the marriage date and place. Death records, again, there's a lot of different places to look. Social Security, Numinant, cemetery records, obituaries, newspaper accounts. Sometimes your person was important enough, there'll be an actual news article, not just an obituary, but news articles. Probate records, tax records, city directories even. You might think, how would a city directory play into this? Well, oftentimes when the husband dies and they're living in a big city where there's directories, the wife will be listed after he dies in the directory, and then next to her name in parentheses, it'll say husband John died 1923 or whatever. And so you'll actually pick up the death through a city directory. And church records can be used. Census mortality schedule. Some censuses, like the 1900 census, there was a mortality schedule that was kept as they went around taking the census, listing anybody that died in 1899, the year before the census. Gives their name, place of death, cause of death. Now that's a record that's available that many people don't know about. And then, of course, there's family Bibles. Now, how can we find specific help for us? Because these are just general things for the nation, for the United States in general. What we can do for anywhere in the world, if we want to find out more specifics of what's available, is to go to the FamilySearch Research Wiki. This is our one-stop shop for anything to do with research around the world. So when you go on FamilySearch, you look at the ribbon at the top of the page under search. When you look at the drop down, research wikis down near the bottom. This is a part of the page that comes up for the wiki. It has a search box. We're looking for different types of records that will pertain to birth, marriage, and death right now. So the thing to do is to fill in that search box in a certain way. Type the location you're looking for. So let's say we're going to look in Missouri, and then put the words record finder. So we're going to fill the box in with Missouri record finder, hit enter, and it'll come up with a page that's going to have all kinds of records listed. It wants, part of it's going to say vital events, but it also covers things like maiden names, family members, immigration, personal details, and all these categories. What they do is they'll give you the category, then they'll show you the best possible records for this location. In this case, the state of Missouri. They're saying the best records for births would be vital records, of course, church records, cemeteries, newspapers, obituaries. Then it'll give you, if you can't find it through any of those, go to Bible records and census records. Now, what's great about this is that those little blue links are actually hot links that are going to take you to articles. And they're not going to just tell you general articles about church records or general articles about cemeteries or newspapers. They're going to be articles about those topics in the state of Missouri and where you can go to use those kind of records or to find those kind of records. So let's take this for a spin. And I thought I had a page here. Okay, well, I don't. So anyway, if you do that, it will take you to a page and it will show you the actual things that you can go to use, like obituaries in Missouri. Where can I find Missouri obituaries the best? Okay, now, guided research is also something that's found at the Wiki. And this was a tool that FamilySearch developed especially for beginners, but it works for anybody. The idea was that they would pick those areas of the world where there are good vital records and assist you in a very simple research process that should get you about 80% of the time, give you the record you're looking for. So it should be about 80% accurate if you're looking for a record that actually does exist. In other words, you're looking for a vital record during a time when vital records existed in that country or location. So to use it, you just click on guided research over here. And so what we'll do is we'll try looking for a 1818 marriage record of my second great grandparents in Ohio. So when I click on guided research, a list of the locations where guided research works is shown to me. And of course, Ohio's in the United States, so I click Ohio, United States. Then it'll give me a list of all the states because they break it down by states. And I click Ohio. A page will come up and it's going to say, okay, if you want to do Ohio births, use these records. Ohio marriages, use these records. Ohio's deaths, use these records. So here's what they offer for marriage records. They actually suggest the place to start would be to go to Find My Past, which is a pay site, and they have a database called United States Marriages, and they have it broken down by state. That Ohio, United States Marriages has over 200 million marriages. It's the single largest United States marriage record database online anywhere. And so that's why it's listed first. It's the most universal of all of them. For this particular search, I decided instead of going to a pay site that you might not be able to get to, I would use the FamilySearch option, which is a database called Ohio Marriage Collections. And what they've done here is they've collected the major databases that they have for marriages. And this is the thing to understand, that there's usually multiple databases for the same thing found at FamilySearch. And oftentimes you don't realize you need to search through several of them. In this case, it will search through 4 different databases for you. It'll search in this case for Ohio church records from 1762 to 2008, county marriages, Ohio county marriages, and 2 different Ohio marriage databases that cover slightly different time periods. So it's really is going to go through 4 different databases looking for what I want. So I put my search in, I go click here and I put my search in for Daniel Beck married to Leah Ono. And what I get are a series of 171 responses or returns. And the first 2 are actually the marriage that I'm looking for. One of them says the wife is Anna Lee, which is a mistranscription. And the other one is to a Leah Ono Lewis, which is also a mistranscription. And this is why you always want to go look at the original record. So we'll take that second one. And you notice they're on the same date. They're the same record in 2 different databases. So I told you they can be found in multiple places. So we'll go look at the second one. And so here's the transcription at the top where she's listed as Leah Ono Lewis. And then below is the actual record. You can see it's just basically a return. It's a marriage return. And you'll notice where her name is found, it says Leah Ono, comma, Lewis Bell, Justice of the Peace, JP. And the transcriber skipped over that little comma and made her Leah Ono Lewis when it's actually Lewis Bell, JP over here. And so this is why you want to look at the original records carefully. But see how easy it was to find this. One search and I had it without any trouble. In fact, I had multiple copies after one search. So guided research is something that's really a nice little tool to learn to use and to teach others. Okay, in conclusion, remember what we're after with vital records is to try to help us get complete information that can fully identify our relatives. And if we can't find vital records, civil registrations, then try to find the best possible substitutes that we can so that we can fill out our family history with as accurate and as complete of information as we possibly can. And so I just want to wish you good luck in finding those vital records of your ancestors. It's a fun challenge for all of us. Okay, if you'd like this class as we close, I'd just like to remind you that the recordings are found in YouTube at the Fresno North State Family Search Center Trainings channel. If you search for that channel name, you'll come to our records. Excuse me, we have about 85 of them now. There is also a little link here in blue to our blog, Fresno North State Family History Center.blogspot.com, where there's a little blurb for each of our 84 or so recordings. It will also have the link to the actual recording. And in addition, one thing that isn't found anywhere else, a link that will get you to a PDF document of the slides that were used in this presentation or any of our presentations so that you can download them and use them as you wish. So, hope you enjoyed this today, and we'll be seeing you again soon. Enjoy.